Welcome back, my lovely readers. I hope you guys have had a really, really good week. I can't wait to dive into some chapters here. We've got some more fun coming up. I know I said that I enjoy the scenes where Sage gets to meet other creatures, but sometimes the interactions that she has with some of the creatures you've already met can be really fun. So anyways, I don't want to give away too many spoilers. I want to jump right in and start the reading. So let's get to it. We are on chapter 12 today for those who are following along and reading along with us. And if not, just listen to me read and count my flubs because you know they're coming. All right. Chapter 12. Gray led the search through the rows of animal enclosures. He moved from one to the other as if looking for specific clues, but didn't tell Sage what those clues were. No wonder he'd been a loner when she met him. Partners were supposed to communicate, but all he'd done was tell her to be quiet and follow. This time was no different. As she wandered behind him through the lion and wolf pens, Sage felt more like a tourist than an investigator. The animal pens were a far cry from five-star luxury accommodations. Dirt, some rocks, the occasional barrel of stagnant water that she hoped really wasn't for drinking. They weren't the type of places one would stash away valuables or even hide a body. None of the pride were suspects, as of yet, and she doubted the pack that shared the space with them would damage their reputation by harming their caretaker. This looks promising. Gray walked towards a tiny house set atop a trailer, just the kind of place a brownie would live in. As if pulled straight out of a fairy tale, everything had been scaled down to childlike proportions. Inside, it boasted a quaint kitchen, living room, bathroom, and a bedroom loft. But crafted for a little person, it had hardly enough space for Sage and Gray to occupy at the same time. I used to dream about having a backyard cottage like this when I was a little girl. Sage admired the detail work of the inlaid wood parquet floor. The kitchen had all the comforts of home. Sure, the oven was easy-baked size, and the stovetop had only been one burner, but it was all so perfectly placed, with not a speck of dust to be found. That surprised her most of all. They lived in the desert. Dust was a way of life. Sage ran a finger along multiple surfaces looking for traces, but her finger came back clean every time. You said magical maids, right? Brownies are the OCD neat freaks of our world. They live to clean. Gray crouched to avoid hitting his head on the ceiling. She's either put a spell on this house or she hasn't been gone long. There's no dust anywhere. That doesn't make sense, Gray whispered with frustration. He bent down and shuffled papers around on the small coffee table. Nothing appeared to jump out at him, and his attention shifted rapidly to the closet and then up to the sleeping loft. Each place he looked seemed to be less interesting than the last. His growls of frustration, however, grew louder and louder as the minutes passed with nothing to show for their exploration. Gray peeked around the kitchen, opening cabinets and closets. Other than being immaculate, the house gave them little of anything to go on. Caleb had mentioned Beth having a new boyfriend. Sage shifted her search, looking for notes or phone numbers and names, anything that might reveal the all-important detail. But even the trash can sat empty. No one could possibly live like that, or be that OCD about cleaning. It was as if Beth were a figment of their imagination, and the house was just for show. Another dead end. Grace sighed, as if resigned to his defeat. Let's go. There's nothing to see here. The animal sanctuary had opened its doors to the public. Enclosures that had been empty were now packed with multiple shifters. Sage had never seen such a spectacle. Being Tara, when she looked into the animal pens, she saw the lions, but also their human shadow, like a ghost hanging around them. The effect had her constantly blinking and rubbing her eyes to be sure that what she saw was real. Excuse me. Mommy! Lion! A little boy squealed. Sage glanced over her shoulder as they passed, catching sight of the child dragging his mother towards the largest of the lion cages. Being able to see through the glamour without trying added a new dimension to how Sage viewed the world. But she couldn't top that little boy's excitement. In his innocent eyes, those cats didn't need to be anything more than they were. By simply existing, they were magnificent. Bit too late to chat with the pride. I doubt any of them are guilty, but we may need to come back again later and conduct interviews. Gray walked slower than usual, as if not altogether there, deep in thought perhaps, something that looked terribly painful for him. At any moment she expected steam to come billowing from his ears. Still new to the magical world, Sage didn't have much to offer, and opening her mouth without something good to add to the conversation would only give Gray ammunition to use against her. Sage, excuse me, Zack had mentioned talismans, and she'd meant to do a bit of research on that. It had to be important. The vampire wasn't one to mention something if it wasn't. His information generally came at a price, but clues were freely given. What kind of item could be a talisman? Caleb had talked about jewelry. What if it really was the boyfriend? And what if the jewelry absorbed them straight into the gem? Sounded legitimate. After all, Sage herself was wearing a necklace containing a stone capable of sucking the magic out of someone. However, that would leave their body behind, and no one had found a body yet. Gray would surely point that out if she opened her mouth to offer it as an explanation. And that too came dangerously close to revealing her own secret jewelry. Rather than speak, she continued to follow quietly as they made their way towards the parking lot. Gray stared at his phone as he walked. He'd taken notes during their interview with Caleb and Marin. He'd photographed the mentalist documents when they'd visited, and he'd confirmed the names and class types of the assistants both had claimed were missing. If there was something tying them together, Gray hadn't said, or maybe he just hadn't figured it out. Between Caleb and Marin, she'd take the former any day. He seemed genuine and protective, at least of his little home. Marin, on the other hand, that guy was too perfect. He had one of those smiles that was meant to disarm, and Gray had said that he was a siren. Perfect for a mentalist, working on the strip. Terras were immune to that kind of manipulative magic, but a siren could easily implant thoughts and suggestions into the minds of humans. Kind of a buzzkill now that she knew how it was done. But could his skill work on others of the magical community? She opened her mouth to ask, but Gray cut her off. This is a transient town, but even I'm wondering why we have 2 missing person cases in as many days, both without a clue to indicate what might have happened. No body, no blood, no sightings, no suitcases, nothing. I feel like I'm going to regret asking this, Sage hesitated, knowing it was a half-baked question. Do some magical types prey on others? Yeah, Gray replied without a hint of sarcasm. But there's usually evidence of a kill. So they're not dead? Gray shook his head. No, I doubt it. But without a body, we can't rule it out. So what happened to them? The more questions Sage asked, the less she learned. Everything was a dead end in both cases. That's what we're supposed to figure out, but with no evidence, motives, or witnesses, we're left guessing. Could someone be collecting magic? Sage wondered. That's a troubling thought. What would they be collecting it for? Can someone use stolen magic? Zack did mention talismans. Gray's eyes narrowed suspiciously. Depending on who's collecting, yes. Okay, so what kind of creatures can absorb and use magic? Every conversation felt like dental surgery when it came to Gray. He was supposed to be your partner. It shouldn't have to be so damn hard to get him to talk. Most just feed on magic. To use it? Gray stopped short again, staring down at his phone as if it held the answer. Would what? Sage demanded, getting more frustrated by the minute. I just had a terrible thought, and I hope I'm wrong. Planning to share or just keep me in suspense? Sage growled almost as loudly as the lions back in the enclosure. Forbidden magic, a conduit of some kind. Not attached, not affected. English, please. Genies, tricksters. Their magic isn't attached to them. It belongs to a talisman that's controlled by others. Sage remembered the new tenant in her apartment complex. Like 3 wishes if you rub the lamp, right? Bingo. But they're a dodgy sort. Not someone I'd want to cross paths with in the dead of night. Gray looked truly bothered by this new lead. Meanwhile, both times Sage had run into her Djinn neighbor, it had been just that, late at night. Either she was supremely lucky or there were different kinds of genies and djinns. She hoped it was the latter. They can't be all bad, right? I've never met one worth trusting. Oh, how many have you met? Enough to know better. Sage opened her mouth, intending to mention her new neighbor, but Gray cut her off. They're all magical contractors of a sort. Due to their particular curse, they have to barter services, so they make you think they can grant your wishes. However, those wishes ultimately only serve the genie's needs. And there's the caveat, too. All magic comes at a price. They charge for wishes. Sage hoped it would be as simple as that. The genie's only able to use his magic when it's wished. The cost isn't to him. Gray shook his head. The magical transaction is the wish that activates the magic. And oftentimes, the price is a soul. The words caught in Sage's throat before she could speak them. The guy she'd met, Luke, he seemed so normal, down to earth, friendly even. They had to be talking about two different kinds of creatures. Gray called it a genie, but Luke had clearly identified as a djinn. Hold on, I'm confused. So the djinn owns the soul, or are they owed some kind of magical debt with collateral? The price isn't paid to the genie, it's paid to the universe for the use of magic. But don't think that the genie isn't angling to get something out of the magic being used. So then people make a deal with them for a little magic assistance, and once the deal's over, they're left with no soul? Who would do that? Sage turned around and took one last look at the animal sanctuary. Had Beth made a deal with the djinn? She'd have to have something to show for it. Sage doubted the brownie had bargained her life for that cute little cottage. Sometimes the promise of having it all is tempting enough to sell one's soul, Gray shrugged. My advice, if you meet one, run. They're completely untrustworthy. You keep calling them genies. Are djinn and genies different? Call them what you will. Either way, they're cursed. Wait. They weren't born like that? Sage asked. Gray looked as if he'd regretted mentioning the tricksters. Of course, she'd be full of questions, and he'd have to be the one to answer them. Djinn were once powerful fae, but they abused their power. Their magic was stripped and bound to a talisman, and they're only able to use the power that they once possessed at the request of another. Since they can't use it for their own purposes, they have to trick others into doing their bidding. They usually only go after humans. Right, because they have no magic. Sage made a mental note to find a nice way to tell her roommate to avoid Luke at all costs. So, a djinn has lots of power, right? And could that power be used to wish someone out of existence? They can't erase someone's existence, but they can kill. That's a scary thought. Which is why I'm hoping I'm wrong. Gray offered her a helmet and mounted his bike. Sage thought again. Her thoughts turned to her new neighbor. He'd openly claimed to be a djinn, but he had done everything in his power to present himself as a friendly person. Was it all a trick? Could he be tied to the sudden disappearances? Do we have records of the djinn who live in town? Reading my mind now, Gray asked. If I only had that power, it would make getting information out of him so much easier. We can run a search when we get back to the office. Most people notify their clans when they change residence. But do they have to register? You're starting to sound like an agent, newbie. I'd give you an atta-girl, but it'd go straight to your head. Just following the logical train to its destination. Sage made another mental note to search for Luke in the A.S.S.E.T database. The next opportunity she could get. Gray had painted the djinn as evil, but despite her newbiness, Sage hadn't gotten that vibe from him. Pushy, sure. Overly friendly, definitely. But nothing to get her spidey senses tingling. Maybe he was just that good of a trickster. Or maybe he wasn't a bad guy. She couldn't throw him under the bus without a reason. Not yet. Not at least. Gray brought the motorcycle to life, and they sped out of the parking lot. Chapter 13. The animal sanctuary had been the highlight of her day. She'd spent the rest filing reports in triplicate, documenting everything they'd seen so far. Since they were still uncertain of the missing Gemini twins and the brownie were linked, each file had to be documented separately, and her hands ached from all the writing. She wondered how she'd been able to hold on to Gray when he drove her home. Magic might not work on her, but Sage counted it as a miracle when they pulled into the parking lot just outside of her apartment. A car was definitely the next thing on her list, once she put enough of a dent into her student loans to afford it. As far as walking-friendly cities went, Vegas did not make the list. But buses might be accessible, if time weren't an issue. The city sprawled out for miles in each direction, had no light rail or subway system in place. Public transportation added hours to what could otherwise be a 20-minute drive. How long would Gray chauffeur her? She didn't even know where he lived, not that it mattered. It never took long for someone It never took long for someone to find playing taxi a burden. She stepped off the bike and handed her helmet to Gray. You want to come in for a bit? We're having game night tonight. Sage knew the answer, but asking the question elicited a much more satisfying response than his reply. He cringed. You live this crap. Why would you want to play it in your off time? Because in the game, I can actually use magic, she shot back at him without a second's pause. Pretend, he corrected her. Better than nothing. She smirked and turned to walk away. The office closed promptly at 6 p.m., forcing her to use her key to enter through a small gate on the side of the building next to the pool house. She unlocked it and turned one last time to see Gray speeding off down the road. Her mind raced with all the clues that she'd picked up during their investigation. There were so many things that she needed to research. If nothing else, she was getting a trial-by-fire education in the variety of supernatural races, which no doubt had been Ava's plan when she'd assigned them this missing person's case. At least her exploits would prove for an interesting reading. Sage took the path around the busy pool, heading towards her apartment. Just past sunset, the night was young and full of promise. Game night was waiting, a chance to blow off steam and make up for her horrible performance in the last dungeon crawl. My favorite Terra in the whole wide world. Zack's voice crept from the shadows. She found him sitting on the stairwell leading up to her upstairs neighbor. Home so late? He stood and walked towards her, the corner of his mouth lifted in a lopsided grin that revealed one of his sharp fangs. They're working you too hard. They have a gate for a reason. No uninvited guest, Sage grumbled, not in the mood to deal with his supernatural bullshit. That was the same thing your roommate said to me when I came calling. He pouted a little too dramatically to be taken seriously. Don't, she warned. Showing up on her doorstep uninvited? He had some nerve. They might be civil to each other in most cases, but this was her home, and he was a vampire. Zack didn't seem to understand that he'd crossed the line. His grin shifted into a playboy smile. He winked, drawing her attention to his icy blue eyes. Aren't we friends? Are we? Anger afforded her immunity to those lady-killer looks of his. Adrenaline sent her heart racing, a vampire a few feet away from her front door, so close to her very human friends. How long had he been there waiting? I'm hurt. Deeply. His expression dimmed, but didn't fade completely. After all the time we've spent together and the adventures we've had. Melodramatic much? She glared at him, debating whether or not to reach for her pocket knife. Touché, Zack cleared his throat. Perhaps I did overplay my hand a teensy bit. Look, I don't have the energy for this. You've been waiting here ever since my roommate denied you access? Why? She wondered if the myth that vampires had to be invited in was actually true. I did scrounge up some dinner, but yes, my goal for the evening was you. Still refusing to accept defeat, Zack waggled a perfectly manicured eyebrow at her. Definitely worth waiting for. What the hell was that supposed to mean? His words teetered on the edge of serious flirting. Too much for her liking. Zack was a vampire. Even if she did want to entertain the idea of dating his kind, they were the most off-limits of anyone in her book. Besides that, how dare he think to hunt in her home? My neighborhood is not your personal buffet. You must really think lowly of me. He could pull that bottom lip out far enough to wrap it around his head. Feigning a wounded ego was not going to earn him any points with her. You said it, she replied. You implied it. But let me set the record straight so there can be no more of this drama between us. He straightened up to his full height and met her eyes. I wouldn't dare harm those you care for. I respect you too much. His faux sadness faded with an impish smirk. I got takeout along the way. Ugh, I don't want to know, Sage groaned, covering her ears in case he decided to slurp or make a further show of how he took his dinner. Of all the terrors in the world, he had to choose to be her friend. Can you stop pretending you hate me already? This game of ours, it's gone on for too long. Zack reached out and pulled her hands down from her head. I get it. I should have called first. I'm sorry. You should be. This is my home, my sanctuary from the crazy. Oh, honey, you have yet to see true crazy, he chuckled. But when she didn't join in his laughter, he stopped and cleared his throat. I'm guessing by your sour mood that your day at the office didn't go well? It was fine. No, I have a lot on my mind. Zack slapped his cheeks in mock surprise. Captain Obvious, I didn't know you were a woman. Do you ever take anything seriously? Only when I have to. Serious is boring, but from the look in your eye, that was today's secret word. Ding, 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 Sage answered back. Ooh, what do I win? All right, I need a sounding board. Well, that is a price worth celebrating. You're coming to me and not Gray or Master Yoda? Zack looked as if he wanted to laugh, but held back, leaving his lips twitching at the corner. You just wait until Devin hears you called him that. Well, traditionally, ogres are green. Zack beamed at her, all of his teeth showing this time. But my point still stands. You're seeking me out for the wealth of my ancient wisdom. Slow your roll there. You might be ancient, but I have serious doubts about your wisdom. And technically, you came to me. Sage pointed to her front door. My house, remember? Got me there. Mischief glinted in his eyes. What if I promised to act really smart? How about you just cut the act? Zack stared at her like a lost little puppy. Okay, look. She hoped she wasn't going to regret this. You want a shot at proving your ancient wisdom? I'd die all over again just for the chance. You tell anyone I asked you for advice, and you might. Promises, promises. Sage blew out a cleansing breath. Being a newbie means constant ridicule, and for what I don't know. Got it. Sage nodded like a little bobblehead. You don't want me to laugh like a madman when you say something stupid. For starters, yes. Jerk. But much less of one than your partner, right? Zack asked. 0.5%, maybe more. If she didn't know better, she might have thought that he was jealous of Gray, but that would be ridiculous. This is how you ask for help? Zack huffed like a disgruntled teenager, comparing me to the grumpy Avenger. Oh, if you're too busy, I understand. Sage turned, as if to leave, but hesitated before taking that first step. Wait! No, for you, anything, he answered a little too quickly and too easily. Zack's help always came with some kind of a price. Careful now, I might take you seriously. And I might have to kill you. His teeth glinted under the porch light. But Sage refused to be intimidated. If you do, make it quick. You take the fun out of everything. You know that? Zack feigned annoyance. Whatever, speak. I'll be your secret keeper. You mentioned talismans earlier. Was that a direct clue or an observation? Zack gave a non-committal shrug. Bit of both, I suppose. Trying to point me towards a djinn? She went straight to the point. That's more than just a newbie speculation there. All the humor left his eyes. The djinn are advanced level criminals. Please tell me A.S.S.E.T is not having you investigate them. But you pointed us towards them, right? Magical talismans? Aren't those what bind a djinn's power? She asked. Yes and no. If your boss thinks a djinn is responsible for the missing people, you need to pass that assignment to someone higher up the chain. Please, Sage. Hearing her name added weight to his statement, as if he truly cared. Sage glanced quickly over her shoulder towards the balcony of Luke's apartment. The lights were on. Was he in there? She'd forgotten to tell Gray about him. Buried under a pile of paperwork, she let the day get away from her. She'd made a mental note. Tell Gray tomorrow. I have no control over what assignments I'm given. Sage turned back to face the vampire. and no one has confirmed a suspect yet. It's still speculation. You have no proof then? No. Zack sighed impatiently. So what do you have? Magical assistants of various groups disappearing, and the people they work for are at risk of losing their businesses. That sounds more like a mob takedown than a Djinn, Zack suggested. Is there a connection to the people being shut down? Not that we could see. Both, I guess, are tourist-type attractions run by people from the magical community. The Wild Sanctuary and the Magician on the Strip. There are plenty of those in this town. Zack sat down on the steps. Magicians, easy work. Competition isn't much of an issue there. His expression tightened. In that same way that Gray's did when he thought about something a little too hard. Sage might have laughed if she weren't interested in what he might say next. So, who benefits if they're shut down? Zack asked. His question hit the nail on the head. The dots might line up if she could figure out the beneficiary. Random acts of violence weren't uncommon in a big city like Vegas, but the supernatural community was more closely knit and had a smaller pool to draw from. Her silence forced Zack to speak again. While you figure that out, I believe it's time to pay for services rendered. What? She hadn't agreed to pay him for anything. Everything comes at a price, dearie. Zack cackled like an evil little goblin, reminding her of Rumpelstiltskin. How about a swift kick in the pants? She offered, narrowing her eyes and daring him to charge her more. It's game night, right? Zack batted those icy blue eyes at her. Let me join your group. She'd never noticed before, but he had some impressive lashes to match, like he was born to be beautiful. That wasn't fair. Yeah, we're having a makeup game night tonight, but why would you... Have you met me? He nearly snorted as his amusement came bubbling out. I'm as geeky as any vampire could be. Why would I not want to join game night? It's a dungeon crawl. Need a warrior? He offered eagerly before she could finish her sentence. With that one question, Zack had totally cast himself in a new light, and Sage realized that she'd been subconsciously giving into her own prejudices. How many times had she been told that what a person did not? How many times had she been told that what a person was did not make them evil? Why can't I read today? Individual actions qualified that distinction, a lesson she needed to pay closer attention to, especially with Luke. The self-proclaimed Djinn was concerned. She could pass judgment on him later, if she survived her night with Zack. He might be a vampire, but he had been nerdier than she in the short time they've known each other, which was an excellent test of this. Not every bad guy is evil theory. But would her roommate be able to overlook the fangs? Matt had already shown himself to be touchy on the whole magical world issue. Give me a chance. I promise. Good behavior. Scout's honor. Do they even have scouts where you were born? She deflected snarkily. So, does that mean you'll let me join your game night? She looked at her front door and sighed. Let me check with the boys first. It's their house as much as mine. The sudden thought that he might not be allowed inside came back to her. Wait here. Zack looked defeated, but stayed at the threshold. Don't be long. She opened the door and shut it immediately behind her. Honey, I'm home. Matt was busily setting up the living room. Beer and chips flanked the newly drawn map of the night's adventure. Your stalker friend has been waiting outside. I know. He stopped me at the door. What does he want? Josh asked, and stood, vigorously whisking up his homemade dip to go with the chips. You boys mind if he comes play with us? She asked casually. Matt looked up like a deer in headlights. He's a vamp. Yeah, I know, but I'll vouch for him. He's not 100% evil. Sage looked over her shoulder. Zack could probably hear every word of her conversation with those bad ears of his. Josh didn't look convinced. He stirred the mixing bowl even faster now, splattering bits of dill on his apron. If it helps, he says he can play a warrior, and we could use another meat shield. Sage kept her tone light. She understood their worry. Vampires could be pretty scary. If it were anyone else besides Zack, she wouldn't have bothered to ask. How do we know he won't... You know, Matt cupped his neck with both hands. Because he's not completely without sense, Zack answered through the door. He's got a point. She fought to maintain her cool tone. Eavesdropping wasn't earning the vampire any points in her book. Harming me or anyone in my family would bring down the wrath of A.S.S.E.T on him. So not worth it, Zack added. Believe me, they'd string me up to watch the sunrise without a trial if I hurt the newbie. Really? That's your play here, insulting me? Sage glared at the door as if she could see him through it. I meant it as a term of endearment. Zack's laughter mingled surprisingly with Matt's. Such a cute little noob. Matt's chuckling shocked her nearly as much as seeing the vampire on her doorstep had. But the fact that he'd finally relaxed, even if a teensy bit, was a good sign. Do we have a choice? Josh sounded as if he knew the answer to the question. I'll buy pizza. Zack sweetened the deal. Josh blew out an exasperated breath. Oh, just let him in before the neighbors complain about his yelling. Zack opened the door before Sage could turn. Thank you. I promise. Good behavior. I didn't invite you in yet, she protested. But he said it was okay. Zack walked in and whispered in Sage's ear. That whole door thing? Not true, by the way. She groaned. Her noob-like ignorance was showing again, and it seemed that the human and vampire alike were keen to take advantage of it. Then why bother with it? Oh, you mean being polite and waiting like you asked? I did say good behavior, did I not? Zack allowed a moment of silence for his words to sink in before throwing another impish wink her way. Unless you'd like me to be naughty, please let me know. She fought the urge to slap him for completely leveling her before game night had a chance to begin. You want to keep those teeth? Your house, your rules. He bowed and twirled away as he came up, walking towards the living room, as if he owned the place. Don't make me regret this, Sage whispered. And that is the end of chapter 13. I cannot wait until next week. I know I say it every week, but I know what's coming. Chapter 14 is going to be good. And if I hadn't already read for 30 minutes, I would have dived right into the next chapter, but we're going to leave it off on a little cliffhanger, how Zack handles game night. Can't wait. All right, so I don't want to make these run too long. I know I say that every week, and every week I have run it to 40 minutes. So we're going to actually cut it off a little bit quicker this time. I hope everyone had a good time. I hope you enjoyed the chapter. I hope you are eagerly awaiting next week as I am. And until then, remember, take care of yourself. Leave some time for self-care, and I will see you next week for another chapter. Bye, guys.